The grand chandelier sparkled like 1,000 stars above the lavish dining table, but the atmosphere in the room was anything but warm. Richard Westwood, a self-made millionaire and one of the most influential businessmen in the city, sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping impatiently against the polished oak surface. His sharp blue eyes, once filled with nothing but pride for his only son, now held a cold disappointment. Across from him sat Ethan, his son, his heir, the boy he had raised with every luxury imaginable. But somewhere along the way, Richard realized he had failed. Ethan Westwood had never known a life without excess. Born into wealth, he had been given the finest education, driven the most expensive cars, and traveled to every exotic destination money could buy. But beneath the designer suits and charming smile was a man who had never truly learned the value of hard work, respect, or humility. And Richard had reached his breaking point. "You need to grow up, Ethan," Richard said finally, his voice firm. "I've spent my life building this empire, and I refuse to hand it over to someone who doesn't even respect the people who work for him." Ethan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, come on, Dad. I'm just having fun. You always act like the world is ending every time I spend a little money." "A little?" Richard's voice was dangerously calm. "You crashed a $300,000 car last week just because you wanted to test its speed. You fired an entire restaurant staff because they served your drink with ice when you asked for none. And just yesterday, you humiliated my most loyal employee's daughter because she didn't fit your standards of beauty." Ethan smirked, rolling his eyes. "Dad, you're acting like I committed a crime. It was just a joke." Richard exhaled, his disappointment deepening. He had given Ethan everything, hoping that love and privilege would shape him into a good man, but instead, it had turned him into someone unrecognizable. A man who saw the world as a playground, and people as disposable. Richard had made up his mind. "You want to act like a spoiled child. Fine," Richard said, leaning forward. "But if you ever want to see a single cent of my fortune again, you're going to follow my rules. And the first rule is marriage." Ethan sat up, his smirk vanishing. "What? You heard me," Richard said, his voice unwavering. "You will marry the woman I choose. A woman who knows struggle, a woman who understands the value of hard work and respect. And you will stay married to her. That is your punishment." Ethan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Richard replied. "If you refuse, I'll cut you off completely. No more money, no more luxury, no more safety net." For the first time, real fear flashed across Ethan's face. He had never known a life without wealth. The thought of losing it all sent a chill through him. But surely his father wasn't serious. Surely this was just another one of his lectures. "Fine," Ethan said, trying to call his bluff. "Who is she?" Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Her name is Ava Brooks." Ethan frowned. The name meant nothing to him. "She's the daughter of Michael Brooks," Richard continued. "The man whose daughter you mocked yesterday." Ethan's expression hardened. He remembered now. The woman in the modest dress, the one who had walked into the restaurant with quiet confidence, despite being surrounded by luxury. The one he had dismissed with a cruel comment about her looks and background. "You want me to marry her?" Ethan asked, incredulous. "Yes," Richard said simply. "And you will." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell his father that he was insane. But when he met Richard's gaze, he knew there was no room for negotiation. He had pushed too far this time, and his father wasn't bluffing. Ava Brooks had no idea that her life was about to change. She had spent years working hard, building a life of her own, never asking for handouts, never expecting favors, and now she was about to be thrown into a world she never wanted, married to a man who despised her, all because of a twisted lesson in humility. Neither of them knew it yet, but this arrangement, this punishment, was about to become something neither of them could have ever imagined. Ava Brooks never expected to be the center of anyone's twisted plan, let alone a billionaire's. She had spent her whole life working hard, helping her father when he struggled to make ends meet, and building a future with nothing but her determination. She never needed or wanted a rich man's approval, least of all Ethan Westwood's, the same man who had laughed at her the day before, throwing insults at her like she was beneath him, and now he was being forced to marry her. It felt like some cruel joke. When Richard Westwood personally visited her father's modest home and laid out the proposal, Ava was stunned. At first, she wanted to refuse outright. No amount of money, no deal, no pressure could make her marry a man who thought so little of her. But then she saw the worry in her father's eyes. Michael Brooks had worked for Richard Westwood for years. He was loyal, hard-working, and had given his all to that company. If she refused, there was no telling what would happen to his job, to their security, so she agreed, not because she wanted a piece of the Westwood fortune, but because she knew the power men like Richard had. And if this was the only way to protect her father, she would do it. Ethan, on the other hand, saw the whole situation as a nightmare. His friends mocked him, making jokes about how he was being punished like a child. His ex-girlfriends laughed, wondering how long it would take before he found a way out. Even his own mother, who had long since divorced Richard and lived her own high society life, called to tell him how ridiculous this was. "You'll never survive it," she told him, over the phone, amused. "You, married to some nobody. You'll be miserable within a week." Ethan wanted to believe she was right, that he could find some loophole, a way to sabotage this ridiculous punishment. But as the wedding date approached, he realized Richard had closed every exit. The prenup was ironclad. If he walked away, he'd lose everything. No trust fund, no inheritance, no access to the business. Just like that, he'd go from billionaire's son to nothing. So he played along, at least for now. The wedding was nothing like the extravagant, high society events Ethan was used to. No cameras, no reporters, no luxury venues. Just a quiet, almost awkward ceremony with a judge, a handful of witnesses, and two people who wanted to be anywhere but standing next to each other. Ava wore a simple dress, her expression unreadable. Ethan wore a forced smile, knowing his father was watching his every move. After the vows were exchanged, and they were officially husband and wife, Ethan leaned in close, his voice just above a whisper. "Don't get any ideas," he murmured. "This isn't real, it's just temporary." Ava's gaze met his, steady and unshaken. "Trust me, I don't want this any more than you do." But the moment they stepped out of the courthouse, reality hit them both. The world saw them as husband and wife now, and with that came expectations neither of them were ready for. Richard wasted no time moving them into a home together, a beautiful, extravagant mansion, one of the many properties he owned. It was meant to symbolize the beginning of their life as a couple, but to Ava, it felt more like a gilded cage. She didn't belong in this world of luxury, and she had no interest in playing the role of Ethan's perfect wife. She kept to herself, spending most of her time in the library or out in the gardens, anywhere that helped her avoid her so-called husband. Ethan, on the other hand, did everything he could to make sure the arrangement was as miserable as possible. He stayed out late, partying with his friends, making sure to be seen with other women, just to stir up drama. He never missed an opportunity to remind Ava that she was just a pawn in his father's lesson. "You don't belong here," he told her one night after stumbling in drunk. "You're just here to prove a point. The second this is over, you'll be right back where you started." Ava had heard worse in her life, but something about the way he said it made her anger rise. She refused to let him see how much his words hurt. Instead, she met his gaze and replied, "We'll see." Days turned into weeks, and despite their mutual hatred for the situation, something began to shift. Ava didn't try to change Ethan, and that annoyed him. He expected her to nag, to demand attention, to act like every other woman he had ever known. But she never did. Instead, she focused on herself, her work, her passions, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt invisible in his own home. It was a strange feeling, unsettling even. He was used to being the center of attention, the one everyone catered to. But Ava, she didn't care about his money or his charm, and that got under his skin more than he wanted to admit. One evening, he walked into the kitchen to find her cooking, something he had never seen anyone in his world do. His chefs always handled that. Yet there she was, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, humming softly as she prepared a simple meal. "You actually know how to cook?" he asked. Leaning against the counter, she didn't even look up. "Not everyone grows up with people doing everything for them." He smirked. "So what? You think that makes you better than me?" Ava finally turned, meeting his gaze. "No. But it means I know how to take care of myself. Can you say the same?" For once, Ethan had no quick comeback. He realized he had never cooked a meal in his life, never cleaned, never struggled for anything. And for the first time, that realization didn't sit well with him. The tension between them grew, but it was different now. It wasn't just anger. It was something unspoken. Something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. And as much as Ethan hated to admit it, Ava was no longer just the punishment his father forced on him. She was something else entirely, and that terrified him. Ethan found himself watching Ava more than he wanted to. At first, it was just curiosity, how she moved so effortlessly through life, unbothered by luxury, by the things that had defined his entire existence. But soon, curiosity turned into something else. He started noticing the little things. How she always left the light on for him. When he came home late, how she spoke to the staff with kindness. How she never asked for anything, yet somehow carried herself with more dignity than anyone he had ever met. And it frustrated him. He didn't want to care. He didn't want to see her as anything more than the punishment his father had forced upon him. But the more he tried to resist it, the more he found himself drawn to her. One evening, after another long day of pretending they didn't live under the same roof, Ethan found her sitting outside on the patio, staring up at the stars. He hesitated. Before stepping closer, "You always sit out here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Ava glanced at him, surprised he was even talking to her. "It's peaceful. Makes me feel grounded." Ethan leaned against the railing, staring up at the same sky. "I don't think I've ever just sat and looked at the stars before." She gave a small smile. "Then you've been missing out." Silence settled between them. But for once, it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt different. Over the next few weeks, Ethan started changing, though he barely realized it himself. He spent less time partying and more time at home. He started asking Ava questions, learning about her past, her dreams, her struggles. And for the first time in his life, he actually listened. But just as things between them started shifting, reality hit harder than ever. One evening, Ethan's old friends invited him to a charity gala, one of the high society events he used to live for. He hadn't planned on going, but they insisted, and a part of him wanted to see if he still fit into that world. Ava didn't ask him to stay. She never did, so he went. The night was filled with champagne, laughter, and familiar faces. And then, his ex-girlfriend Vanessa appeared beside him, draping an arm around him like she had never left. "You finally ready to come back to real life?" she teased, her voice dripping with charm. "That little charity case of yours can't possibly be keeping you entertained." Ethan stiffened. "She's not a charity case," he said without thinking. Vanessa laughed. "Oh, please. You can't actually be serious about her." Ethan should have ignored her, should have walked away, but instead, he found himself questioning everything. Was he really falling for Ava? Or was he just caught up in the novelty of something different? That doubt festered, and by the time he got home that night, he felt more confused than ever. Ava was waiting for him, sitting on the couch with a book in her hands. She looked up when he walked in, and for the first time, he saw something he never expected. "Hurt. You had fun?" she asked, closing the book. Ethan hesitated. "It was just a party." Ava nodded, standing up. "Of course. That's who you are, right? The man who belongs to that world." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. "You don't understand." "No, I do." She cut him off. "I was never supposed to be more than a lesson for you, and that's fine. I knew that from the start." She turned to leave, but Ethan grabbed her wrist. "Ava, wait." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he wasn't ready to name. "Tell me, Ethan," she whispered. "When this is all over, when your father finally gives you your freedom back, what happens to us?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out because he didn't know, and that silence was enough for Ava to pull away. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment between them. The way she looked at him, the way she made him feel like he was more than just a spoiled rich kid. For the first time, he saw himself through her eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. The next morning, Richard Westwood called him into his office. "Your punishment is over," his father announced. "You've lasted longer than I expected." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "So, what happens now?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "You can walk away. I'll restore everything. Your accounts, your access to the company. You're free to go back to your old life." Ethan sat there, staring at his father, realizing something he had never admitted to himself. His old life didn't exist anymore. He had changed, not because of the punishment, not because of the money, but because of Ava, and he wasn't ready to lose her. Without another word, Ethan stood up and left. He drove straight home, his heart pounding, his mind racing. But when he arrived, the house was quiet, too quiet. Ava was gone. Her things were missing, her side of the closet empty. And on the kitchen counter, there was a single note: "I won't be a lesson anymore." Ethan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. For the first time in his life, money couldn't fix this. For days, he searched for her. He went to her father's house, but Michael Brooks only shook his head. "If you love her, you'll have to prove it." Ethan had never had to fight for anything in his life. Everything had always been handed to him. But this was different. So he did the only thing he could. He gave up his inheritance. He walked away from the company, from the wealth, from everything that had once defined him. And then, with nothing but determination, he went to find the woman who had changed him. It took weeks, but when he finally found her, she was back in the small bookstore she used to work at, living a life she had built for herself. She looked up when he walked in, surprise flickering across her face. "Ethan," he smiled, genuinely, for the first time in a long time. "I had everything," he said, stepping closer. But none of it mattered until I almost lost you. Ava searched his eyes, looking for the man she once thought she knew. But he wasn't that man anymore. Why are you here? She asked softly. Because I love you, he admitted, the words feeling right for the first time. And I don't want this to be a punishment. I want it to be real. Ava studied him, and for the first time, she saw it. The change, the sincerity. The man who had finally figured out who he was meant to be. And this time, when Ethan reached for her hand, she didn't pull away.